All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're doing a true crime style deep dive into what is honestly one of the most intense and legendary murder trials ever put to paper. We're pulling this straight from Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov. We're going to completely break down the anatomy of a patricide. That's the brutal murder of a father and the eldest son who was put on trial for his life. We'll be digging into the motives, the physical evidence, the brutal psychological warfare, and the incredibly toxic family dynamics that led to a courtroom showdown where literally nothing is exactly as it seems. It's a story that basically laid the groundwork for modern criminal psychology, and it forces us to ask a profoundly chilling question. Are some people just born to kill?
I swear by God and the dreadful day of judgment, I am not guilty of my father's blood. Now just picture the scene. That is the desperate, agonizing plea from our prime suspect, Dmitry Karamazov. Imagine him standing before a packed courtroom, a man notoriously known for his violent temper and unchecked passions, screaming his innocence to a room that has already completely condemned him. So the central mystery we are unpacking for you today is exactly this. If Dmitry didn't kill his wealthy, cynical father, Fyodor Pavlovich, then who did? To figure that out, we have to look really, really closely at the family itself.
Which brings us to Section 1, the Karamazov bloodline, a legacy of baseness.
So before we even think about looking at the crime scene, we've got to understand the psychological DNA of our suspects. The sources define their driving energy as the Karamazov force. What is that? Well, it's this unbridled, primitive sensualism. It's an explosive, completely unnatural mixture of the greatest heights of generosity and the absolute deepest depths of human degradation. It is basically a shared psychological curse that infects this entire family line. At their core, these are people who simply cannot draw a boundary line. They are capable of immense, self-sacrificing love, sure, but they are equally driven by this reckless, almost diseased sensuality that makes them incredibly erratic, volatile, and, quite frankly, highly dangerous to anyone in their orbit. You can really see this when you look at the tragic mirror image between the victim and the prime suspect. Think of the father, Fyodor Pavlovich. He is a cynical, hoarding buffoon. He practically abandoned his kids to be raised by servants and distant relatives just so he could openly revel in a life of unapologetic debauchery. Then, look at Dmitry, the eldest son. He's a fiery, impulsive sensualist, completely driven by this twisted, reckless sense of honor and an unchecked rage. They clash so violently, precisely because they're cut from the exact same passionate, destructive cloth. They absolutely cannot stand each other, mostly because they are entirely too alike. And just to quickly round out this total philosophical powder keg, we have the other two brothers. There's Ivan, the brilliant, totally cold intellectual who floats the idea that in a world without God, everything is lawful, which is, a highly dangerous and deeply destabilizing idea to just throw around in a family already so prone to violence. And then you have Alyosha. He's the gentle, spiritual youngest brother who is constantly, desperately trying to mediate all this madness swirling around him. But as you'll see, even Alyosha's pure intentions can't stop the horrific collision course between his father and his eldest brother. Let's move to Section 2, a rivalry of sensualists. The battle for Grushenka.
Okay, so here is the explosive catalyst for the central conflict, a phenomenally toxic love triangle. The father, Fyodor, is aggressively lusting after a young woman named Grushenka, and in a bizarre twist, Dmitry becomes so utterly obsessed with the exact same woman that he completely abandons his proud, aristocratic fiancée Katerina. And Grushenka, well, she masterfully plays both the father and the son against each other. There is something darkly absurd about a father and son openly competing, literally throwing their lives away for the same romantic interest. But hey, for the Karamazovs, that's just a Tuesday. It's a fierce, deeply humiliating competition that pushes Dmitry to the absolute brink of sanity. But actually, scratch that. It wasn't just jealousy driving this train off the tracks.
That brings us to Section 3, the motive, a bitter financial dispute. 3,000. I really want you to lock this exact sum of rubles in your head. 3,000. Dmitry is absolutely convinced that his father has robbed him of exactly this amount from his late mother's inheritance. And Fyodor, purely out of spite and rivalry, outright refuses to give him a single penny of it, especially knowing it might help Dmitry win over Grushenka. So love and jealousy were the kindling, right? But this money was the spark. But why does Dmitry need this exact sum so desperately right this second? It all comes down to stolen pride. And this ties right back into that volatile Karamazov force we talked about earlier. See, Dmitri misappropriated exactly 3,000 rubles that his ex-fiancée Katerina had trusted him to send to Moscow. Instead, he took it and spent half of it on a wild, chaotic bender with Grushenka. Now, his twisted sense of honor is just torturing him. He genuinely believes he absolutely must repay this 3,000 ruble debt of honor to Katerina before he can feel morally free to truly be with Grushenka. This frantic, obsessive need for this specific amount of cash creates a crushing, unbearable pressure on his already super fragile psyche.
So let's look at Section 4, the night of the murder, mapping the crime.
Let's actually walk step by step through the chaotic sequence of events on that fatal night. When nightfall hits, Dmitri goes into an absolute jealous frenzy, convinced Grushenka has gone to his father's house. He grabs a heavy brass pestle, a solid metal tool for grinding spices, and he rushes out into the dark. Moments later, he creeps up to his dad's house and taps the secret window signals. These are specific knocks that only Fyodor and his servant Smerdyakov know, meant to let Grushenka inside. Shortly after that, while he's peering into the window, Dmitri is intercepted in the dark garden by the loyal old servant, Grigory. In a total panic, Dmitri turns and strikes the old man over the head with a brass pestle, leaving him bleeding in the dirt. By midnight, Dmitri flees the scene terrified, but crucially, he leaves an open door behind him.
When the authorities arrive, all that abstract hatred of the Karamazov family is finally anchored in a very grim physical reality. Stepping into the scene like procedural detectives, the facts are gruesome, but they seem clear. Fyodor Pavlovich is found dead on the floor, his skull crushed. Nearby, a torn pink envelope is discarded, and this is key. This envelope was famously prepared by Fyodor with exactly 3,000 rubles inside it, meant as a bribe for Grushenka. The money is completely gone. And that brass pestle Dmitri brought to the house, it is positively identified as the murder weapon. I mean, on paper, it looks like an entirely open and shut case.
Section 5. The dramatic trial, anatomy of guilt.
So we step into the courtroom and the tension is unbelievable. We've got a methodical, physical case built by the prosecution going head-to-head against a brilliant psychological counter-narrative from the defense. For premeditation, the prosecution points to a drunken letter Dmitri wrote days earlier, explicitly threatening to kill his father. But the defense counters using the psychology we established earlier. They argue Dmitri is an impulsive sensualist. He writes dramatic letters to vent his rage. He is not a cold, calculating killer. Then there's the weapon in the scene. The prosecution says Dmitri brought the pestle and left the door open after committing the murder. The defense argues no, he dropped the pestle in the garden while fleeing from the servant, and he never actually set foot inside the house. Finally, the motive. The prosecution points to the torn envelope as absolute proof he killed his dad for the 3,000 rubles. The defense fires back that there is zero material proof Dmitri actually took that money. But then, out of nowhere, comes the trial's ultimate jaw-dropping twist. Both Dmitri and his intellectual brother Ivan point the finger completely away from the family, straight at Smerdyakov. Smerdyakov is the illegitimate, highly cynical servant of the house. Sure, Dmitri had the obvious motive, the threats, and was at the scene. But Smerdyakov? He actually lived in the house. He was one of the only people who knew those secret window signals. He knew about the envelope of cash. But he had a highly convenient epileptic fit that very night, giving him a picture-perfect alibi. And the darkest twist of all? Smerdyakov mysteriously commits suicide the night before the trial, taking his secrets straight to the grave. This leaves Ivan to completely lose his mind, raving in the middle of the courtroom that the dead servant was the true killer. The trial just dissolves into absolute chaos. So the defense attorney realizes he has a massive uphill battle against the physical evidence and this chaotic courtroom atmosphere. So he pivots. He goes for a deeply provocative, philosophical argument. He dares the jury to look closely at the victim. He says, the father is not merely he who begets the child, but he who begets and does his duty by him. He is straight up asking the jury to consider if the brutal, cynical, negligent Fyodor even deserved the sacred title of father. He argues that to convict Dmitri is to condemn a man who was systematically pushed to the edge of insanity by a father who mocked the very concept of family. But the prosecutor is absolutely not having it. He delivers this chilling, high-energy summary of the wild, unbridled, uniquely destructive nature of this family. He tells the jury they have their Hamlets, but we still have our Karamazovs. He paints Dmitri not as a victim of a bad childhood, but as the ultimate, terrifying culmination of the Karamazov force, a force that simply takes what it wants, driven by pure sensualism, crushing absolutely anything in its path, even its own blood.
Which leaves us with the ultimate question, the exact question Dostoevsky wants burning in your mind as the jury goes to deliberate. Even if the physical hand of another person, perhaps the servant Smerdyakov, actually struck the fatal blow while Dmitri fled the garden, did the toxic Karamazov legacy ultimately commit the murder? When a family is this steeped in hatred, jealousy, and unrestrained passion, isn't the tragedy kind of inevitable, regardless of whose physical hand holds the weapon? It is a fascinating deep dive into legal guilt versus moral guilt, inside a family that was destined from day one to destroy itself from the inside out. Think about that. And we'll see you in the next explainer.